Welcome to the Streets and People podcast presented by Get Around Cabo Carfree. Get Around Cabo Carfree is a volunteer community movement advocating for more transport options for people who can't drive in Caboolture and Morayfield in Queensland. In today's podcast, we'll be covering one of these three broad topics. It might be Road Rules 360, where we discuss Queensland's road rules, the legislation, the design for people walking, biking, in wheelchairs or on a scooter. It might be Not Everyone Drives, where we chat with people whose transport options don't include a car in a car-dependent society. And it might be People and Projects, where our conversations are with people working on a specific aspect of inclusive transportation. Today, it is one of our Not Everyone Drives episodes. It's our very first one, in fact. And I thought because Kirk is one of our volunteers, I would ask Kirk to come along. And we're here on Gubbi Gubbi country in Caboolture, Queensland, and you live a little bit down the road in Morayfield.
Yeah, that's correct.
And we met at the Morayfield Shopping Centre office. I was complaining about the lack of bike racks. I was very grumpy about that, and I just front up to people and I go, "Hello, I've got this community movement, Get Around Cabo Carfree. Would you like to join us?" And you said yes, and you said you would be interested in volunteering, and we talked about a bike path. We talked about a few different things. So tell me, what is your background in why you would be interested in Get Around Cabo Carfree? Maybe your own experience with getting around places, wherever it is that you've been, where you haven't needed to use a car for that.
What got me into this whole thing is before, when the fuel prices started going up,
When was that?
2 years ago now. At the time I was a support worker driving all around the countryside, and I just kept looking at the fuel gauge and the prices of fuel going up and not getting reimbursed as much. And then I just decided to get something that was a little bit closer. From there I ended up having the goal to pretty much ride to work. I had one daughter at the time, and I started taking her to daycare on the push bike and noticed that some of the roads weren't really that safe.
Yeah, so one of those roads was Walker's Road, which is just about to be made into... So there's a term here which a lot of people won't be familiar with called a strode, which is not a street and not a road. Basically, the way that Strong Towns define it, Strong Towns is a community organisation that we are very much aligned with. They've got great ideas. They say a street is basically the little suburban streets, and a road is the highway, so the Bruce Highway, that sort of thing. And what we've got in places like Morayfield Road, Walker's Road, King Street, they are basically suburban streets. They're in urban areas, but they have the layout and design of a road. They have highway conditions. It's not good as a little suburban street, but it's also not good as a highway because you've got all these traffic lights and driveways and entrances and things like that. And Walker Road, which is just going from a sort of smaller road, now becoming quite a bigger road. Does that sound about right?
That sounds about right. Because of that, I ended up having to go down Oaky Flat, Morayfield, Caboolture River sort of thing. And I've been lucky and fortunate enough to go on some of the footpaths, but anyone that rides around there knows that some of the footpaths aren't really up to scratch.
Yeah, and a lot of people who are pedestrians and in wheelchairs and frail don't like people riding their bike on the footpath, and it's not really appropriate for that, but we don't really have a choice because you're either going to be mown over by somebody in a car. And recently I was on King Street and there was nobody in the right hand lane. It was banked up cars parked on the road shoulder, and I didn't want to be on the footpath because it's actually not very easy to ride your bike on that. It's a lot of driveways and it's quite bumpy and it's quite narrow. So I was on the road and I was in the left hand lane, and there was this driver and he just has this great big SUV and he just drove in a very intimidating fashion. He could easily have been in the right-hand lane, but he chose not to. And these are experiences when you're riding a bike. I'm not a Lycra biker. I just use it as my form of transport because it's so much cheaper and more enjoyable and relaxing, except when people are intimidating. And these kinds of experiences are the kind of ones you get on the road. So you can't be on the road, you can't be on the footpath, and the road shoulder, people have their cars banked up and We don't have the infrastructure for it. So.
Well, not only that, you're also at risk of things like glass, bottles, debris that just gets swept onto the side of the road. And not to mention is when you've got cars backed up, you've got a moral dilemma. Do you take the footpath or do you take the lane? It can also be nerve-wracking to take the lane because sometimes you have to take the lane to stop someone from overtaking you, but then you don't know what their sort of attitude is towards cyclists.
It might have been exactly like I experienced the other day,
Yeah.
where somebody was just wanting to be difficult and aggressive because their sense of entitlement on the road.
Yeah.
Many drivers think that bike riders shouldn't be even on a road, that they're not allowed to be, which of course is not what the legislation says, and it's not appropriate to be like that.
Yeah, and it's also, when it comes to giving way, if a car's exiting a street, they've got right of way, but then it completely changes when a car is entering a street where most times that gets ignored.
It's a complicated thing. John Burrill, in our Road Rules 360 episodes, he and I are actually going through all the bike rules at the moment because of this real complexity and ambiguity. And in this situation, it's like that, and in that situation, it's like that. And it's really not very straightforward about who has priority and who doesn't. And we've come across some situations that John and I will do in a future episode where he has to write a letter to the minister to get clarity on who actually has right of way in this situation. John is the road rules subject matter expert for road rules at the TMR in Queensland, and he retired about 6 years ago. And he said, this is not clear what the legislation is. So for somebody on a bike who doesn't know the legislation inside and out, what hope have we got? That's what it's like on Walker's Road, and there's no pedestrian crossing, there's nothing like that. And you had a little person on the back.
Oh, yeah.
So she was 1 or something at the time.
Oh, about that, yeah.
You're just a dad, an amazing dad. I would have to say you are probably the most stellar dad that I've ever come across, because you've got now 2 little people, and both girls have had some health issues, and you're a very devoted husband, very devoted father. I think your wife is a very lucky gal. And your 2 girls are very lucky to have you as a dad. You're very engaged in that space. You want to be protective, and you also want to do the right thing by them, and you want to bring them out into the world. So you've got them on the back of the bike, but you have these situations where it doesn't kind of work like that. Tell me, what have you noticed when you're out with the girls on the back of the bike?
The oldest one now, she wants to go, on the push bike instead of the car.
Yeah.
Since then, we've changed daycares to a closer one. Each morning, she'll hop on the bike and she'll wave to people. And as soon as I arrive at the daycare, a lot of the younger children are like, oh, what's that? Oh, you're riding on a push bike. Getting very excited because it's a different form of transport compared to the car.
Yeah, a certain level of novelty.
Yeah, and not to mention it keeps them active. I guess it's also helps them learn a level of resilience, because you're essentially moulding them to be a better part of society later on in life.
I remember you telling me previously, before you had your new baby, so you're doing more volunteering before you had your second person. Which I was personally a bit devastated, I must say. When you were going, oh, we're pregnant, I'm going, no! I think you said, she's like, yeah, bike ride. And then you're on the bike and you'd be riding in the area, and she would start to look around. So she wasn't on a screen. She wasn't having to be distracted and kept quiet. She was super curious. And what sort of things did you notice that she was interested in?
She'd see puppies, dogs, interactions that you wouldn't normally get in the car. She was able to see the local area, birds, and even being able to take the detoured route to be able to just enjoy the scenery, enjoying the atmosphere.
Because the detour made it much more enjoyable. So you then thought, oh, we can actually do this. And it's a great bonding experience, a dad and little person moment. And I think she was starting to get some recognition about the birds.
Yeah.
And the trees and the flowers and other kids as well, and waving.
And now that she's about 2.5, her vocabulary is just gone from really beginner's baby language to advanced sort of toddler's language, and being able to pronounce words and being able to communicate really well. And I believe that's also to do with the interactions we've made, minimising the use of phones and technology and just enjoying the interactions.
So, there's that thing of kids don't play outside, they're always on their screens. But actually what you're saying is that the urban environment doesn't really allow children to play outside anymore and feel safe. It's quite an intimidating space on the roads outside in my place. It's quite a quiet suburban street. I'm in this office a lot of the time, and there's so few cars that come past in a day, and yet because the speed limit's 50, and that's a speed limit where drivers won't look for people, they're looking for more objects. But when you bring down the road speed and drivers are going at a much safer speed for families, children, people on bicycles, it makes all the world of difference. And that would certainly be something that would be easy to apply in your area. You live in one of those new estates down in Morayfield.
So I do, yeah.
I think the streets are quite narrow.
Most of them are quite narrow. The street that I'm on is relevantly wide, but the side streets are quite narrow. It's interesting with talking about streets, is streets used to be a place of community sort of thing where, you'd have kids playing in the street, and now it's just like move over everyone else, and, it's all about the efficiency of the car, and doesn't mean that they're going to get from A to B faster.
I think the difference between 30 kilometres an hour and 50 kilometres an hour is about 5 minutes.
Yeah, it's not much.
And really for children's safety and children's activity levels, because when children cycle to school, it actually increases their cognitive skills, so they get higher marks at school. It also makes people feel less depressed, less socially isolated. We know from the pandemic it's a really huge issue. Just on Walker's Road, there was another park.
There was a few parks, because at the time I was at another daycare. But on a side note, with talking about mental health and stuff, since I've been riding to and from work, I feel a lot better and a lot healthier. I don't know how I managed to do it, but one ride I ended up doing 49 kilometres on a short burst. It checks it on their GPS sort of thing. And
okay.
I don't know how I did it. I must have had me wheat bix that day.
So were you going 45 kilometres an hour?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
okay.
No,
we don't
not
say
distance.
that because I'm not quite sure what the speed limit is, Kirk.
Oh, no, that one was on Oakey Flat Road, so that was 60.
Okay. All right, so you were doing 45 kilometres an hour, but I'm not sure what the speed limit is for bicycles on a road. Do you know that by chance?
I don't think, as far as I know, there's no bicycle speed limit. I know that e-bikes are capped at 25.
Yeah.
The motor cuts out at that speed.
Because I've got an e-bike. John and I are going to discuss that in another episode. Mia Zellman, I just published that yesterday. Mia and I were having a discussion about how kids used to use the streets. It was seen the same way that people use parks. And when I grew up as a child, I grew up in another city. It was quite a rural area, probably quite similar to Caboolture in many ways. It would have been the equivalent of something like Morayfield Road in the olden days. Apparently, previous local residents used to do is on that road, they used to put a tennis net on the middle, and they would play it. And then when a car came along, on that rare occasion when there was a car coming along, they would stop playing tennis. But that's what they used to do. And that's the sort of thing that we've lost, I think. And we talk about social isolation as if it's caused by the phone, but I think it's so much more complicated than that. And I think it's much more about our urban design. I see that, for instance, people have 8-foot fences, so I don't even know who my neighbours are. I mean, I've seen them and I know their names because I'm a super friendly person. But a lot of people have got these very high fences. I understand the yearning for privacy, but it does mean that you never get to know your neighbours. And there is some subtle message that says, I don't want to know my neighbours. And when people get in cars, you can't bump into them either. People aren't walking so much either. We actually don't have any footpaths here on this street. But there are some parks for the bike ride that you used to do to the other childcare centre. We wrote a letter to the council and they didn't make any comment about making those paved. And I think that's definitely something that we would love to do. And I'm wondering if we could do some placemaking stuff. We would never encourage any illegal or inappropriate activities, but I have wondered that if you had a truck and some tarmac, could you just kind of plonk it down there? Because, well, if the council's not going to do it, then who's going to do it? I'm definitely not advocating for inappropriate, illegal. We're just here to entertain and inform. We're just to play around the ideas about what are the possibilities and to think about, well, what could we do? So yeah, that's one thing that I have thought, because that's a pity, because if you can cycle through a park, as you said, your eldest daughter, she's now at that age, she loves to be out on the bike. She must be pretty much soon ready to be on with her own wheels too.
Well, she's getting better at her balancing bike. She's slowly getting the hang of it, which is good. Just got to do it more frequently. Well, the other day I actually saw Wendy at the markets. We bought my eldest daughter her balancing bike. Yeah, she was having fun with it. By the end of it, I think my back was a bit sore having to hold down. I'm thinking about getting a rod or something to hold it up, but I think by then she'll probably get the hang of it and I won't need it.
Yeah. I grew up a long time ago and there was no such thing as a balancing bike. It was always this idea of trainer wheels. I didn't know anything about a balancing bike for kids. How is that design different from an ordinary bike?
The main idea behind a balancing bike versus a bicycle with training wheels is it teaches kids how to balance before they pedal. The logic behind it is training wheels, they don't actually teach kids how to ride. It's fun, but the problem with training wheels, you're better off with a tricycle, because the riding mechanism with training wheels is different from a bike, because with a bicycle you're having to lean in.
Okay.
Where you are limited in doing that with training wheels, because it limits you from actually being able to lean in and turn.
Okay, so what you're saying is if you do the trainer wheel bicycle, that's more similar to a tricycle in terms of learning the skills. In order to learn the skill of balancing, which is probably better for younger people, to learn that lean, it's actually better to have kids on this balancing bicycle.
Yeah.
It doesn't have any pedals. It's more like a Fred Flintstone kind of bicycle where you're walking along and doesn't have any pedals. It sort of gives the impression of that, and it helps build some of the small leg muscles and the idea of balance in the body. And then the next step is to get them to learn how to pedal. Bicycle.
The ultimate thing on a push bike is more so the balance than the actual pedaling. Once you learn how to actually balance the bike, it's just like the moment that you actually learn how to ride a bike is usually when your mum and dad's behind you and they've taken off the training wheels and they're behind you and you think they're still behind you, and then you're just going off in the distance where you start pedaling, you don't realise they're there, and then as soon as you look and go, and then you fall off your bike.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. So there was a lady that I met on the Wamuran Rail Trail, and she's got some hearing issues, and she wanted to take up bicycle riding. She's sort of lost her confidence. Maybe a tricycle would be better for her. She likes the idea of cycling. You know, she loves to be on the Wamuran Rail Trail, and she has this idea that she wants to meet with friends. Maybe she just, instead of having a bicycle, which has more complicated balancing issues, she could actually just get a tricycle. And I see those around everywhere, and they're fantastic because you can put some shopping in the back and you don't have to worry about that balancing issue. So that's a good suggestion. Now I'm going to suggest that to her. What was it like to volunteer with us? Because I think you were volunteering for about 6 months with us on a very engaged level. What did you... I mean, basically, you have to say that I'm fabulous. What did you appreciate about volunteering with us, or what did you learn, or what did it give you, I guess?
Yeah, I think it was just it was good to engage with people with like-minded mindset that had the idea of creating something that used to be a people-centric place so that people can go from A to B with as much choices as possible. If they want to be able to ride from A to B or walk or even catch the bus, to be able to do it in a safe manner. And that means if you did drive, you could have a choice of getting there safely using other methods, or if you didn't drive and you had no choice, you could get there safely without any issues. So making walking, cycling, taking the bus more convenient, so you're more than likely to continue it that way.
And as you were saying that, I thought your two little people have had some medical issues.
Yeah.
You don't earn a fabulous salary.
Oh, no.
You have very modest means. Your wife, she's working.
Yes.
But you're both on fairly modest salaries and incomes. having one bicycle just reduces the financial burden of driving. And if everybody could cycle everywhere, we're not saying nobody should drive. What we're saying is, for the journeys that are short enough to cycle, gee, wouldn't it be great to be able to do that safely without feeling like you're going to be run over at any moment?
Well, that's it, because currently we do have 2 cars, but the long-term goal is being able to only have 1 car instead of 2 cars. So that means we're not having to pay double the registration, double fuel cost. We only need to fuel up 1 car rather than 2 cars. And if it's raining, we'll make do. The only time that I probably get dropped off or drive to work is essentially if it's monsoon or rain.
Yeah.
But I think that's the odd exception. A little bit of rain doesn't hurt anyone, I don't think.
No, I cycle in the rain quite regularly, and I go for a morning bike ride on the Wamuran Rail Trail. It's actually lovely because here we are in Queensland, it's quite hot, the sun's quite piercing. Just a gentle rain, it's really lovely. It makes such a difference.
I think the most important thing, as long as you've got good quality rain gear, it makes a difference. Because another thing to mention at work, there's another person that actually is starting to ride from home to work, and she lives in the same estate as I do. Okay.
So do you guys ride together?
No, she starts a little bit earlier than me. So and I thought, well, that's good, that's awesome.
That's fantastic. And do you have bike racks at your workplace?
Yeah, I get VIP parking.
Yeah, fantastic.
Well, what's currently happening at the moment is the parking lot, because it's limited car spots, it's only reserved for, visitors.
Yep.
So workers have no choice, but they have to park on the street.
Yep.
But what's also happening is there's development going behind the facility, so they cannot park in front of where the developers, because you're getting heavy trucks coming through they have to park further. So short term, they pretty much have to park further away, and I just come along and ride my bike to the front door, lock it up.
So a couple of things there about parking. On our Get Around Cabo Carfree page, I don't know if it's the case on what the version that you see. I took a photograph because I was down at your place.
Yeah.
In your garage, I parked my bicycle, your bicycle, and then your wife's car. You could see we had 2 cars and plenty of space, and then there's this great big car. So one of the big things about cars is people don't realize how much land space that costs and takes up. And that is actually a huge problem. And the other thing about parking, because what that does is that each car space, I've got somebody coming, his name's David Meffam, he's going to talk about parking. My understanding is that a car space in a garage is about $50,000 each one house. So that adds on to the price of your mortgage. Now, if you didn't have a car, or you only had 1 car, you would still have to pay for that, because there's this thing called minimum parking mandates, which is a crazy thing that the US put in 1960s, which they're now actually completely undoing. But for some reason here, we're just doubling and we're going on as if it's 1960. It's crazy. But I digress. But the thing about cars is they just take up so much land space, and there is this idea that if you're in a car, you should be able to park right in front. But when you go to a shopping centre, you park right at the other end of the shopping centre car park. But for some reason, in all other places, like out the front of a house or something, that's my land, but it's actually public land.
Yeah.
There's something strange that happens in the idea that it's okay to park a caravan on public land, but you can't put, I don't know, anything else.
Yeah.
It's just this strange idea that you're allowed to do that. And it's very cheap. It's too cheap. This is the high cost of free parking. What I was really thinking about for you is you have very modest means. If you have 2 cars, they're quite new cars. I mean, I'm not saying you have the top of the range. You've been obviously very careful in what you've chosen. But chances are that's going to cost, for the 2 cars, $24,000 a year. And the fact that you've got this double garage, which if you had an alternative, you might not even use, because if you had an alternative transport mode, you might not want to have that. So you wouldn't have to pay for that. And then you wouldn't have to pay for the parking, and you wouldn't have to pay for the cars. Your mortgage, your lifestyle would be so much cheaper, but there's no alternatives. Does it make sense what I'm saying? Yeah. So you would save the $24,000 a year, plus you would have a lower mortgage because you wouldn't have those 2 garage spaces and the apron space. And then actually you can start to look at creating higher density housing. So you've got more townhouse kind of structures
That's
rather than you've got to have this low structure because there's basic mechanisms about parking. It's quite a complicated thing. When I started this community movement, Get Around Cabo Carfree, which is focused on getting around people car free, not saying the place has to be car free, just saying.
No.
I just thought, well, why can't we just get some bike lanes and bus stops and more bus services? But then I've discovered there's this whole thing about minimum parking mandates, which has this huge financial burden and huge land space burden, and developers charge for that. You know, the developer's not bearing that cost. They're not going to be out of pocket. It's you as a family man who is burdened by that. Strong Towns talks about the Ponzi scheme of the suburban rollout, actually, because we're actually financing new suburban homes on the future. But at some point, that's all going to fall over. It's not going to be sustainable. So I think we've talked about quite a few exciting things. If you were to say to somebody who would like to volunteer or who's interested in this, and basically I want them to volunteer because it really helps me when other people are in on the thing. So no matter how little, what would you say is useful for people to know, or do you think would encourage them to do that?
Well, I think overall, I think it's good to do these projects as a group, because at the end of the day, it's really challenging to do it just with one person. And most likely, you'd be a person that would be getting frustrated because the footpath ends, or if you are in a mobility scooter or wheelchair crossing the road and there's the path is uneasy and it's essentially dangerous, or even when it comes to temporary pathing where they just say, oh, this pathway is closed, get on the road to get to the other side if you're in a wheelchair. So
you would say, if that's your beef, then come and be part of this. This episode will undoubtedly go to councillors. So what would you like your local councillors and state MPs and federal MPs to know? Well,
I just hope we manage to put infrastructure in that's going to benefit everyone, and by doing so would also reduce congestion and also encourage others to take other methods to get from A to B.
If you are on limited means, having some choices just makes a heap better opportunity for your, like, how you can live. And if you're not spending all your money on car insurance and things like that, then you can actually spend it in the local community.
Well, that's it. And take an example where I live. If I was to catch the train, I'd have to walk 45 minutes to the train station.
To Morayfield Station from your place?
Yeah, because there's no proper bus service. So I'd either have to drive to the train station. Not everyone's got that option. But then that kind of defeats the purpose.
So you would like a decent bus service, is what you're saying. Was there anything else you would like to add before we close up?
Not that I can think of. I'll probably end up thinking of it after, but that's a whole different story.
You can post it on the Facebook page or put it in the comments section of the episode or something like that. So I think that's it, and thank you very much for being such a enthusiastic volunteer. It's very much appreciated, and such an amazing dad and husband, so that's also lovely. We will keep on keeping on, and I think we'll call it a day. All right.
Sounds good.
Thanks, Kirk.
All good.
Thanks for enjoying Streets and People, presented by Get Around Cabo Carfree. We publish our podcast regularly at the usual places and on our website, where you can find out more about us. getaroundcabocarfree.com.au. That's www.getaround, get around, that's pretty straightforward. Cabo, C-A-B-O, that's short for Caboolture. Carfree, C-A-R-F-R-E-E. There's no hyphen in that. .com.au. Our theme music is The Thief on AM Sound, which is just like our cars on our streets, always stealing the space. So let's stop that thief.